Welcome to The Real Life Buyer. In this podcast, you will discover interviews with procurement and technical experts, business owners, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders. These experts will help you to develop and grow, accelerate your career, improve your business, save money, and buy smart. Now introducing The Real Life Buyer, Dave Barr.
Hello and welcome to The Real Life Buyer. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Mark Herschberg from New York City, author of the Career Toolkit, Essential Skills for Success That No One Taught You, and an accompanying app. Mark has quite an extensive resume, so I'll read some of it out for you now. Mark studied at MIT, where he earned a Bachelor of Science in Physics, a further Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and again on to a Master of Engineering in the same subject, but this time with a specific focus on cryptography. Here, he also helped to start the undergraduate practice opportunities program, dubbed MIT's Career Success Accelerator, where he teaches annually. Mark has spent his career launching and developing new business ventures and has considerable knowledge and experience in networking, negotiating, communicating, leading, and career planning, just to name a few. Mark has also worked at the Harvard Business School, where he helped create a platform used to teach finance at prominent business schools. On a more personal note, he excels at ballroom dancing and owns a diverse cufflink collection. Very interesting diversion there. So what I'm particularly interested in discussing with Mark today is his expertise in negotiation and the influencing of others. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Mark onto the podcast. Hi, Mark.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited to share some tips with your audience.
Fantastic. Indeed, I'm really looking forward to things. So let's start with something very familiar to yourself, your book. Can you reveal a little bit more about your background and what led you to write the Career Toolkit?
I have a very interesting dual career track. I came out of MIT in the 90s and started as a software engineer and realized early on I wanted to become the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer. But to be the person who leads the engineering team, it wasn't just about being a good engineer. Yes, I had to be able to write code and solve technical problems, but I also had to learn how to lead, how to negotiate, how to build a strong network, how to communicate effectively. And no one ever taught me that. That's not part of your standard undergraduate or even graduate curriculum. So I had to develop those skills in myself. As I was doing so, I realized these skills are not just for executives, but for everyone on the team, down to the most junior person. We all benefit by having these skills. So I began to develop up my team. Shortly after, MIT had been getting feedback from the companies who come and hire our students, and they were saying, your students are great, but there are skills we really want to see: leadership, communication, negotiation, and we just can't find it. Not just in your students, not just in college students, but anywhere, because no one else is teaching this. So we created this program, and when I heard MIT was doing it, I said, I've been working on this with my own teams. Can I help out? They said, yes, please come and share what you have. So I helped create some of the content. And then MIT asked me to help teach alongside many of the professors. And I've been doing that for the past 20 years. So I have this dual career where I've been a CTO and I've been growing teams, negotiating plenty of contracts with vendors and suppliers and customers. But then this parallel career where I've been teaching, and now I have the book and speaking related to these professional skills.
Fantastic. 20 years. So you certainly have done the rounds and probably seen many, many different scenarios. So looking forward to this discussion then. So negotiation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you believe a buyer should best prepare for a negotiation. What sort of things do you do in your sort of remit?
As is implied by your question, preparation is such an important piece. I just want to talk about that for a moment before we get into specifics. So many people, probably not most of your listeners, but so many people just think, well, negotiation, you sit down at the table and you do it. But it's kind of like saying, well, if you're a footballer, you just go onto the pitch and play, because that's all we see. We just see them on the field. But in fact, any good footballer is practicing. In fact, they're spending a lot more time practicing and preparing. They're running drills, they're playing scrimmage games, they're watching tape of themselves, of their opponents, long before they set foot on the pitch. And we as negotiators have to do the same thing. The best negotiators, like the best footballers, have done a lot of preparation. So what do I do before I go in? There are a couple different things I'll think about. First, what are the range of outcomes? What's my BATNA? BATNA, as many of you probably know, is the best alternative to negotiate agreement. What's my walk-away price, at which point I say, I don't even want to do this deal? What's my aspirational outcome? If everything aligns, where do I think I can go? What are the likely outcomes in the middle? What might be relevant to me? What's more important? What's less important as I trade certain things off? And then I do the exact same thing, but from the perspective of my negotiating partner, the customer, the vendor, whoever's sitting across the table from me, who I refer to as your negotiation partner. I think about from their perspective and how they're going to propose things or counter propose or maybe react to things. And that's going to help plan out where I might go. I also think about what type of relationship this is going to be. Is this a one-off purchase? Am I buying a used car? Or am I creating a vendor relationship that's going to go on for decades? And it's really more of a strategic partnership, because if it's a single round versus multi-round engagement, that's going to change the dynamics as well.
Okay. So if we're talking about, let's say, a long-standing relationship, you may have already been working with this individual, this company for some time. And okay, you probably, but not always, generally talk about an annual negotiation. What other things do you bring in? You're already familiar with the person, you're familiar with the product or the service. What things do you bring into the negotiation to add to it?
If you've had a good relationship with this vendor, and we know not all of them are, right? There are plenty of long-standing vendors, but it can be tense at times. But if you have a good one, well, it's a great place to start, because now you have some trust. You know it's a solid relationship. You expect it's all going to work out. You're not trying to necessarily nickel and dime the person, or I don't know what the equivalent is, pence and pound and pence the person.
Yeah.
For every last detail, because you all see the bigger picture. And this can allow you to get more creative, to go in other directions. Maybe there are additional services to explore between the two of you, additional product offerings. Maybe there are ways, and certainly you're coming in and say, okay, let's just go. There's going to be some annual increase or volume change. And you're going in with that, but can you be more creative? Can you, for example, do some type of joint marketing perhaps? Even if the company, you're like, well, you're just a widget supplier and no one knows about widgets outside the industry, or customers or consumers. They don't care about the widgets, they care about the finished product. Well, maybe even within the industry, you could do some joint marketing ventures about how these widgets are really awesome and makes a great product, and how other people should be in your product, other vendors should be in your product because that's such a great brand. So you can be creative and say, let's really explore other possibilities and see if we can increase the pie, rather than just how are we going to divide it up again this year.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And certainly for myself, that I would have, I'll also bring into their performance that they've managed to achieve in the given period, be that a year or more, their delivery, their quality, their service, their responsiveness. As you say, there's some good points there. Perhaps there's some mutual opportunity for development. Perhaps they have some skills and competence that can help your business and vice versa. So you rightly say you're looking to develop that relationship and cultivate it into perhaps something that's not just a transactional relationship anymore, more of a strategic relationship where you help each other develop. So yeah, that's really good. The thing that can be challenging, though, sometimes is, particularly as we're living in a global trading economy, is that our buying patterns are by definition global in nature. So what kind of recommendations do you have for buyers when adjusting their style for negotiating with different cultures? So it could be from US to US, but also to Asia or to Western Europe. What sort of things would you look to modify and change in those discussions?
If you haven't gone into that country before, if you haven't negotiated with people from that country, consider even hiring an expert who understands negotiations in that culture. Because when you look at the value of your contract, it might be worth spending thousands, maybe even $10,000, $20,000 to get that expert if it's going to give you the edge in that contract negotiation. We know there are different styles, and this can range. I'm going to just take some very clear examples just to illustrate this. When you think about that classic bizarre haggle in some cultures where we know your first number is outrageously, laughably high, and mine is so incredibly low, and neither of us takes that seriously, but that's how we start. That's just how negotiation proceeds. In other cultures, that can be insulting. In some cultures, it is okay. In fact, it's a normal negotiation tactic to yell, to pound the table, to storm out. And yet in other cultures and Asian cultures, none of that would be acceptable. That would actually sour any potential relationship. Now, those are examples you're probably familiar with, but even understanding more subtle things like, is silence showing that they're disinterested? Is silence they are considering? Is it normal that they don't respond for a week? Is it normal to have a few dinners and socialize before the negotiations start? Or is it just down to business? And those subtle things can get that relationship off on the right foot or the wrong foot. So having someone come in and just give you some guidance, at the very least, read up on negotiations in whatever culture you're looking at, or bring in an expert, because that can really make or break how you're going to go in that negotiation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Certainly see that culturally, huge differences. I've negotiated in all the different countries we mentioned just before. Certainly I see a very different style in Italy, for example, where the guys are very passionate about what they do. And perhaps they use gestures somewhat more than other people do, where they're a little bit more fixed and rigid. And certainly they use tonality in their expressions rather more than some other cultures. So I absolutely agree with you. There's huge differences between different cultures, even different industries in different cultures as well, and how they behave. So some really good points there. And you say you can always Google it, as they say, and look in various different places. But interesting that you bring in somebody from that culture to support you. Obviously, if you're a global business or part of a global organization, hopefully you'll have people that are at hand as well, who already live in those places. So absolutely.
Even if they live in those places, they may not be experienced at negotiating in general. So recognize what they do and don't bring to the table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's much debate as to, and I think you've touched on this, some of the words you used just now, as to the approach negotiators should take. And some suggest win-win is always the thing to go for. And that's the style that I think more Western people would tend to go for sure. Whilst others focus on winning at all costs. They must win, irrespective of whether the other person loses or not. So what are your thoughts on negotiating principles? And would you expect a change of style depending on perhaps the industrial sector or the business size or situation one might find themselves in?
Asking what is the right negotiation style is a little like asking what is the right way to be someone's friend. You might have someone where you two are best friends since you were 5 years old and you have this incredibly close relationship. You might have friends where, hey, you go out for beers, hang out at the pub, but that's about it and you're not super close. You might have lots of casual friends. You might have a couple close friends. There's lots of different ways to have friends. There's no one right answer. In fact, you might even have different types of friends across all your relationships. And the same is true for negotiations. There's no one, well, this is how you have to do it. If you are doing a one-off transaction in that I'm going to buy the used car, you know what? I should win at any cost. I'm never going to see you again. I don't care if you like me. I don't want to cross any ethical lines, but it's about me winning. On the other hand, when we have these long-term relationships with suppliers, this is a mistake we saw with labor negotiations back in the 60s and 70s. Companies said, and even before that, certainly going back to the late 19th century, right? Crush them, take them for every penny we can get. Well, these are the people who are actually working at your company, right? And then they push back, oh, we've got the upper hand now, take what we can get. Instead of, you know what, we're going to be working together for a long time, for decades to come. Let's figure out how we can optimize for both. Let's do a global optimization. Now, it doesn't always mean win-win. Even then, even when I take this, hey, I want to make sure we're getting a good solution. I'm not just trying to take everything I can from you. Still doesn't mean I really care about helping you. What I teach my students is I care about helping me. Your needs aren't really relevant to me, except in that I need you to agree to this deal. And if I don't give you something you're willing to accept, I'm not getting the deal I want. So I care about you to that extent. And the model that I think best describes this comes from a professor I work with, Larry Susskind, who's a negotiation professor at MIT. In his book, Good for You, Great for Me, he uses the model of what we want to do is figure out how we can expand that pie, but then I still want to grab as big a piece as I can get. because if I can expand the pie, if I'm just going to use numbers to illustrate this, if I'm getting a value, pie is worth 100 and I'm getting 80 and you're getting 20, but if I can expand that pie to 200, well, then instead of 8%, maybe I can get 85%. And now you're only getting 15%, but that's still more than what you were getting before. Now you're getting 30 instead of 20. Okay, great. That's a better deal for you. I've made it less fair in some ways, but it's still a better deal for you and definitely a better deal for me. So I don't always think about win-win and let's make sure we're all treated fairly, but I do make sure it's an agreement that you're good with, or I'm not going to get the agreement I want.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly the car salesman, there's so many different aspects you can take about that. As you say, you could be just buying a vehicle and don't really worry too much about the after service, the aftercare, and it's just purely a single transaction. But there's also areas where you can nibble. You want to make sure that it's been serviced properly. Perhaps you can get the service thrown in as part of it, or what we have as the MOT, make sure it's got a test certificate and it's obviously functionally correct. Maybe you want some mats in there. So I refer to it as nibbling away at perhaps some of the other things. You try and get the price to where you want to be, and what other things can you get added in? So there's lots of different aspects you can bring into the discussion. Some people just think about buying the vehicle, but there's a lot more to it. I'm not sure if it's the same as you have in the States, but certainly vehicle manufacturers are looking for longer term relationships with their customers now. So you see a different practice. Do you agree with that now?
Yeah, certainly for the cars, they are. And I'm using the used car from someone through what used to be the newspaper classifieds or however you do online, where I'm just not going to see you. But you're right that a dealer recognizes it's not just selling you the car. It is that service. It's that longer term relationship. I know you're going to need another car sometime down the road, so I want to build that relationship. And there is more value. In fact, my understanding is most US car manufacturers make more money, or at least more profit, on the servicing rather than on the sale. And to your point, good negotiators know that you want to have a multi-topic negotiation. You don't just want to say, well, let's just talk about price, because that's zero sum and there's not things you can trade off. But when you get to these other things, the service and the warranty and inspection, all these other things, you can begin to trade off and find ways to generate more value on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really comes to expanding, I guess, what you refer to expanding the pie somewhat, bringing in different aspects about these things. And obviously in bigger negotiations, there's lots of other aspects I'm sure our listeners know about, obviously looking at payment terms and various other factors. So yes, that's good. Now, one of the guys that I've tended to follow quite a lot, find quite intrigued by his teachings, is a chap called Chris Voss. And I'm sure you're familiar about Chris. For those people who perhaps don't know who Chris is an FBI or an ex-FBI negotiator who has written a book called Never Split the Difference. And he's come out with lots of different interesting negotiation techniques from the viewpoint of an FBI guy, of course. And in his game, if somebody makes a mistake, then the consequences can be quite huge. Either the hostage perhaps loses their life, or people in the near vicinity, perhaps the attending law enforcement. And so they're interesting concepts there. And I'm just interested to know how familiar you are with Chris's work, and how do you feel about some of the things that he refers to in his book?
In preparation for the show, I actually ordered his book, and I'm about 8 chapters in. So about 8 of the 10 chapters, I've gone through most of it. It is not a book I would necessarily recommend, maybe as your 7th negotiation book. And on my website, I do recommend a lot of books, from Getting to Yes, Bargaining for Advantage, 3D Negotiation, Start with No. It's a wonderful negotiation book. My issue with Chris's book, and I'll preface this by saying he is obviously a fantastic negotiator. And if your family is ever kidnapped, call him, not me. Right? He's much better at that. But his background comes from a very specific type of negotiation. To your point, never split the difference, right? This is his mentality. And that's a good mentality. That's what we want. You don't want him to say, well, look, you kill half the hostages, let half the go, and we'll call it a day, right? But we know that is very often, I'm not saying you always split it down the middle, but we have to do those trade-offs in what we do in business. He also often deals with people very emotionally. When you're taking hostages, even if it's not a bank robbery gone wrong, even if it's a plan, we're taking the hostage and it happens over weeks, it is still very emotional. There are guns around. You're worried, are they going to storm or compound? Emotions run high. And I'm not saying business negotiations aren't emotional. There can be, but it's far less emotional and it's less personal. And so he takes a very emotional approach. And I think that is less relevant to probably what a lot of the listeners do into looking at how we need to negotiate, how we need to think about things. There's things in the book that are helpful and useful. I'm not saying they're wrong, but I think just the perspective he takes is not quite the right approach. There are one or two things that are wrong. I'll just mention this briefly because this is a pet peeve of mine. I talk about it in my book. He mentions the 55-38-7 rule, the rule that most communication is nonverbal. Right? Only 7% of communication is verbal, and you have to really focus on the emotions. That, by the way, is utter bullshit. That is a complete misinterpretation of the original 1967 research paper. And I'm not just calling out Chris. Actually, across the internet, people get that wrong. But it's that approach where you're focusing more on the emotions than on the actual words and what's being offered. So if you've read a number of negotiation books, if you feel pretty good and you want to get that emotional component, I think he does a better job addressing some of the emotions than other books do, but you should not start from an emotional basis unless you are dealing with hostages or these really intense emotional situations.
Yeah, you mentioned a good few other books when we started the conversation. Do you have any firm favorites or certain techniques from those firm favorites that you particularly enjoy and use regularly?
I do. And I would say, well, across all books, and Chris is right about this, is you do have to take your emotion out of it. You have to check yourself because it's possible for you to get wrapped up. And so you need to say, hey, you know what? Let's take a break. Let's pause, or I need to go back and assess or check with others. All of them emphasize planning, as I did from the start. That's really key. Bargaining for advantage, one of the things I like about that book, it's very detailed and specific. And it talks about how to think about making an opening offer or a counter offer. It gives a lot of really good tips in there. One of the things I like about 3D negotiation, and this is a much more advanced book, is that we often think of negotiation. Before you've learned anything about negotiation, we always think of that used car example, right? And it's just that zero-sum negotiation linear. We as negotiators know that's not how the world works. It's usually multi-issue, and that's good, and we're going to trade things off. But of course, really advanced negotiators know you often get multi-party negotiations. Now, that might not be in a sale. It could be because you have to get buy-in from other teams.
Yeah.
You have to get sign-off from other groups. But some of the biggest, most complex negotiations are often multi-party. You might have a town, and you might have some local interest groups, and you might have the voters, and you might have a company or two companies, and they're all trying to hammer out a deal. And 3D negotiations, they get into how to think about sequencing, who you engage with, and how to really optimize. Some of the work that I did when I was an undergrad, I also minored in political science, and there's this concept of agenda setting. How you approach changing a bill when it's going through Parliament can adjust what the final outcome is and even whether it passes or not. And there's research showing it really does matter how you sequence this. And the same, I believe, is true for negotiations. So you can get some really interesting and advanced techniques.
Okay. Of course, again, if you've got the combination of politics and multicultural aspects as well, that is extremely challenging, I would guess. Can you draw upon any examples that perhaps you've had yourself that you could embellish on a little bit?
I'm trying to think about the complex multi-party negotiations, and those are usually, I'd have to get really detailed to go down a rabbit hole to get into some of those.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, just thinking about toolbox, your negotiation toolbox, what were the classic things that you'd say that people should be familiar with, be comfortable with, and should call upon and frequently? Is that 80-20 rule exists for your toolbox negotiations as well? There are things you want to tease out and talk to people about?
I would say certainly doing your research, as we began the show with, is just so fundamentally important. And that can really make or break your negotiation. If you are prepared, if you've thought through what are some of the ways we can go and how can I be prepared for it, I think that first and foremost needs to be the first tool in your toolbox. Learning to listen, of course, is really important. And that means, what are they saying? There might be some tonality and body language you can pick up. It's not the majority. The majority are the words, but it's not to say there's no information conveyed in that. Even what's not being said, even learning to recognize when people try to do the tricks of saying, oh, no, I could never give that up. Oh, no, that's so important. And of course, they're just trying to amp it up because it's meaningless to them and they can trade it away. That's obviously, I'm doing that a little exaggerated, but learning how to read things like that and read through, I think those types of skills, which is a broader part of listening, matters. Having different people on your team trained in the negotiations and getting different perspectives from your side can be really powerful, as well as training up other people on your team. And in fact, I'm going to sidestep a little and say everyone at a company should learn to negotiate. Normally, companies think, well, my buyers do, procurement certainly does, and salespeople, they need to know it. Remarkably, they don't always train their people to do it, but they at least understand why it's important for those skills. But really, the whole company should. And people say, wait a second, if I teach everyone to be a better negotiator, when it's time for those annual raises, oh my God, whoever the company, they're going to do better. And my counter argument is, okay, let's suppose everyone's magically a 3% better negotiator. And so everyone gets a 3% raise instead of a 1% raise that year. Yes, costing you more money. But now, if all your contracts, if your customers are paying 3% more, if your vendors are doing 3% less than what they wanted, if during those internal conversations between your employees or employees to manager, if all those went 3% better, what is that going to do to your bottom line? So I would say also important, this might not be in the toolkit, but it's about handing out the toolkit to everyone, because the more good negotiators you have in your organization, the better the outcomes of conversations and discussions will be across everything you do.
No, that's a brilliant point. Yeah, absolutely agree. And it's, if I go one step further, we talked about the workplace there. I've got a teenage son, and it's very obvious the more, as I've seen him grow up, how important the skill of negotiation is for young people to develop in their daily life, as well as in the future when they have their working life. But I don't see it being actively nurtured and taught in schools and colleges. You touched on that earlier. So do you think this should become part of our mainstream educational curriculum? And if so, when, in your opinion, would be the best time to introduce this for young people?
100% this should be taught. In fact, all the skills I talk about in the book should be taught, because they're not skills I just came up with off the top of my head. They're ones that companies are saying, we want. This is what we're looking for. Why do we teach people computer programming or marketing or accounting? Because companies say we want people with those skills. Well, they're telling us these are the skills they want too, but we're not teaching them. So it absolutely should be taught, along with many others. And I would argue we need to begin teaching the concept of negotiation probably sometime around the age 14 to 16 is when it should first be introduced. But of course, it's not a one and done. It's not, okay, this year you're learning, in my case, US history, and next year you learn world history, and year after that, something different. That's great. I'm glad I learned US history and world history, but it's not going to be something I'm calling upon regularly. On the other hand, when you think about English, they taught me that every year because I'm using it every day. So negotiation falls more into that category. I'm not saying every year you need to have it, but I wouldn't just say you did 4 weeks this one year in school and you're done. You want to come back to it a few times and get more advanced in both high school and in college.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So certainly I know my son, I certainly find children excellent negotiators because they keep asking the word why. So we tend to lose that, I think, sometimes a bit later on in life. But I think it would certainly help them in their interactions with their peers as well as their teachers as well. So I'll be tempted to say it even a little bit sooner for myself. But great point.
I point out, because people often ask, well, is negotiation natural? It might be foreign for people. It is natural. If you've ever had a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who doesn't want to go to bed, wants to play more on the iPad, doesn't want to eat their vegetables, they negotiate, right? And what do? Okay, eat 2 more pieces of broccoli and then you can have dessert. They're negotiating inherently at an early age. So it's a very natural thing for us to do.
Yeah, absolutely. We touched on the word communication a few times, and we all know the book by Stephen Covey. I expect we do, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the 5th habit, seek first to understand, then be understood. So what tips and tools, perhaps any techniques, do you recommend when trying to ensure clarity of understanding of others?
Communication is one of the broadest topics I cover. But I cover this in chapter 7 of the Career Toolkit. I get down to really the essence of it, which is recognizing that we all have different mental models. We all carry different concepts in our head. And that can be as simple as we use different terms, right? We're both speaking English, but we definitely have different terms. And I fortunately happen to know British English, American English, as I'm sure you do. Oh, okay, you meant something different. I remember one of my professors, after class, he asked students where you could get a fag, which in the US is a derogatory term for someone from the LGBTQ community. But he, of course, was just talking about a cigarette.
Yeah.
Thankfully, not an issue. And that's very easy, but illustrates at a tiny point how we can have totally different things. I'll say, oh, okay, you want to meet some guy tonight? Let me put you on some dating sites. But typically, we have these mental models. We have these things, these assumptions in our head, or how we approach things or think about things. And the more you can recognize your own mental models and that of other people with whom you are engaging, the better you can do in translating your ideas to fit that mental model, and you become more effective at communicating. I really break down how to do this and how to recognize mental models in the book.
Yeah. Certainly, I'd say one of the skills that sometimes can be lacking is the listening skill. And people, when they're talking, are often thinking about what they're going to say next rather than listening to what the person's actually saying in front of them. Is that something you believe is also the case, or what's your thoughts on that?
100%. And you pulled the words right out of my mouth. I forget the exact quote, but are you listening to the other person or waiting to speak? Because so many of us say, okay, right, keep in your head, you're going, yeah, finish up, because I've got a really important response to this. And so I'm not thinking about what you're saying. I'm thinking, how am I going to respond? And what am I going to say? And okay, I'm going to address it this way. And I missed half of what you're saying because I thought I knew it 5 seconds in. And so it's very important to really focus on what are you saying? And I often teach people equally important is what you're not saying, or how you're saying it, because we could say the same thing 6 different ways, but the fact that you're saying it this way gives me some insight into that mental model, into how you're thinking about, or what might be subtly one direction versus another in what you're saying. So you really have to focus on what people are saying, at least in important conversations. For you're hanging out with friends, you're distracted, you're watching the game, you're chatting, that's fine. You don't need 100% focus all the time. But for important business conversations, including our negotiations, you need to be focused and listen. And it's okay if after you finish speaking, I need to say, okay, let me think about that for a second and then respond.
Yeah. Do you believe in actively repeating back to people in a number of different ways what your interpretation of what they're trying to say is, to make sure that you really believe the essence of what they're saying?
I want to distinguish 2 things, because there's something near to what you said and there's what you said. So one technique, I think Chris actually includes this in his book, is repeating back the last 2 or 3 words. I have not yet seen research on whether that's effective or not. And again, this is an emotional technique that if I repeat back your 2 or 3 words, I do a type of mirroring. I have not seen research if this works. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I just haven't yet seen research that it does. But then to your point, that's the real, let me summarize. So you are offering this and that, and we're going to do it this way. And I very much encourage that. And I talk about that in the communication chapter, I think in the business, in the management process chapter of my book. I think I address it as well, because when you say it to me and then I repeat it back, it makes sure if there's a misunderstanding, or if I choose a slightly different word that means something different to you, we can catch it right then and there and say, wait, you use this word. I just want to understand, is this how you're really thinking about it? And that is a great way to catch issues early on. It's not foolproof, but I am a big fan of it.
Yeah, that's great. Great. The other thing I'm trying to quite often be conscious of is not everybody is auditory, and sometimes the visual side is better. And if I'm still not sure, or still not convinced the person has actually, or I've actually fully understood, I will try and draw something up on a whiteboard or something similar to try and represent what's happening here, be it a process or a technique or something like that. Do you think it's important to mix up different techniques, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, etc., to make sure that the person you're talking to is actually connecting in their preferred way?
It can be. I came across some research recently that said the concept of some people are more auditory learners versus visual versus other things is actually a myth. And we really don't have many strong preferences. Now, that's not to say people in a meeting might not say, wait, we just put this on the whiteboard, or can you just draw the diagram? So if someone says this is useful to me, I'm trying to get you to do a deal. And if this helps you feel it's more useful, it gets you closer, I'm going to do that. I very much recommend when you walk away. So perhaps you're not done with the deal, which obviously would have some contract, but at the end of today, here's where we are so far. Send that email saying, here's what we have concluded. Here's what we've reached so far, and spell it out in details. And then if there's a disagreement, so I say, oh, wait, I thought we agreed to something slightly different on point number 3. And that's going to help you catch it as well. That's almost a version of the repeating it back. That's just making sure we're all saying this is what we are agreeing to.
Yes, it's interesting. So I'm quite visual. I can hear things, I can try and picture things, but for me, the best thing for me is actually going to see what we refer to as going to the gemba in the manufacturing world, go to the point of where the work is being done. And then I can connect with things far better if I can see it in practice. And so it's not just a bunch of words where I believe I can picture what's going on. I can actually see what's going on, and then my brain engages with it fully. And I've used that with, certainly when I've been dealing with people that are, say, not fully familiar with the manufacturing techniques I'm talking about. And I'll try and use photographs and videos and other things to really make sure the clarity is there. And that's been quite successful, I find.
And certainly this goes to the mental models that some people do look at things a certain way, and you want to align to that.
Yeah. Okay. Now, conscious of the time, I'm watching the clock as we're going. I've got one more question to talk to you about. If people want to learn more about your book, the work that you do, where would they find you in? What's the best social media places and websites to refer to?
You can go to my website, thecareertoolkitbook.com. There you can learn more about the book as well as where to buy it. Obviously, Amazon, local bookstores. There's an ebook and physical book. On the contact page, you can reach out to me. You can follow me on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. There's the app page. You mentioned the app earlier. So there's a free companion app to the book that has a lot of the great tips from the book. And as long as you open it just once a month, that's all you have to do. Then you don't have to open it again. We just need to know you're still active. It's going to pop up a tip every day at the time that you designate. So you can passively be reminded of what you've learned from the book, completely free, available on the Android and iPhone store and linked from the website. And then there's the resources page. On the resources page, I link to a whole bunch of other books, including some of the negotiation books we mentioned, other great books, free online resources. And there's a number of downloads, for example, how you can develop these skills across your entire organization. So all that's on the resources page, and all of this can be found on the website, thecareertoolkitbook.com.
That's great. There's certainly I've looked, spent some time on your website, and I've downloaded the app, and I find them extremely informative and really good, helpful information. So this is where it comes into the last question. I want to make sure people fully understand what you're able to impart, what knowledge you're imparting in your book and through your app. I believe you have obviously I've seen your book, and you've got a number of sections, and they're all can be read as separate chapters as well. Could you just talk through the key points of your book and what people will find and how they engage with the content in that book?
Sure. The first chapter is how to create and execute a career plan. Because so many people say, well, this is where I want to be in 5 or 10 years, but they just cross their fingers and hope. You'd never do a 1-year project and say, well, let's not create a plan. Let's just hope we achieve it in a year. Right? You create a plan, but of course, you're going to have to adjust the plan. I teach you how to do this for your career so you can increase the odds of getting to where you want to be. The other chapters get into specific skills, networking, negotiating, communication, leading, interviewing. I focus a lot from the hiring manager's perspective because we rarely talk about that, but many of us have to hire our peers. So we go down to each of these skills. As you point out, you can jump around. You can just jump to this chapter, then go back to that one. They stand alone. And each one, there is a mental shift. There is a change in how you are looking at this type of skill. And then it's followed by what are the actual concrete things you can do to improve your outcomes, either ways you can train or things you can do when you're networking or negotiating to be more effective and get more success. And so that's how the book works. There's, again, the companion app. So as you read it, you get that reminder, because I know you read a book like this, I do it all the time, you forget 30 days later. So that's going to help reinforce your learning. And then the Career Toolkit development guide on the resources page of the website, that is how you can create a training group for free at your company to really enhance the skills of yourself and other people in your organization.
Okay, so just to some context, how big is a book? Are we talking like 100 pages, 200 pages?
It's I think about 270 pages, and each chapter you can read in about 30 to 45 minutes.
So it's quite an extensive read then. So it's a weighty book for people to get hold of. So there's a lot of content.
There's a lot of content in there, but it's very digestible because you can just say, I'm going to read this one chapter, and then you can put it down, go do something else, pick another chapter when you're ready for it.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. Well, I think certainly it would be valuable for people to go and have a read of that book. I've been scanning my way through the book. I found it very informative. And as I said, the app is very useful as well. And this combined with the discussion we've had today on negotiation, I think people have had some great pointers on which other books to also refer to as well. So I think it's been a very valuable session we've had today. So thank you for that.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, absolutely. And hopefully we'll be able to do another podcast at another time, and perhaps we'll go into separate chapters and talk about some of the other fantastic things that you talk to people about.
That'd be great.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that, Mark. I hope everybody's listened and learned a lot from today's podcast, and hope you have a wonderful day. So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it, and it's given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. If you are a purchasing or a supply chain professional, business owner or director, come and join my Facebook group, the Purchasing and Supply Chain Community Hub, a safe place to engage with like-minded, friendly people. See you soon. Bye.